I hope you enjoyed Steve and Lisa as they performed in 2017. They have become a favorite of ours and a favorite of the Symposium, and they'll be back next year on March the 5th, 2022, when we have our live Symposium. So Steve and Lisa will be back and they'll work out another program. We got permission from them to use that tape, so we're really, really thrilled about that. Our next tremendous speaker is a friend of our symposium as well, John Marszalek from Mississippi State University. He and his wife Jean come up every year. They're invited, and this is their third time. John is a huge fan of Schuler's Donuts. I'm really disappointed that we can't have a virtual donut for John to have him enjoy the virtual trip to Springfield, Ohio. John too is a veteran. He's a veteran of the Army in the Vietnam conflict. He achieved the rank of captain. He was trained in infantry at Fort Benning, Georgia. And then he went into Baltimore, Maryland, to a fort there that's, in all honesty, unfamiliar with me. So I'm going to have to look at my notes and find out what the name of it is. It was an intelligence school called Hollowbird in Baltimore, Maryland. In Vietnam, he was part of the psychologist or psychological operations battalion. And again, I said he's achieved the rank of captain. He went to Canisius undergrad, and from Notre Dame University, Fighting Irish, he got his master's and doctorate from there. He taught at Canisius, at Gannon, as well as Mississippi State. That's where he is now. He retired several years back, and he's now in charge of the U.S. grant papers, which is hard to believe that way up in the north, the U.S. grant papers are down in Mississippi now. John is the curator of those. He is in charge of those, and he has done a phenomenal job in the process of reproducing the grant papers for all time's sake. Again, John is retired. He is now the executive director of the U.S. grant papers, as I mentioned, and he's a director of the Mississippi State Distinguished Undergrad Scholars Program. He's written over 300 articles, about 12, 13 books. This is his latest one. This is the annotated grant memoirs by John and his crew. He also is a Sherman guy as well, and this is his book on Sherman. He is going to speak, as you see today, he's going to speak on Grant and Sherman and leadership. So, John, thanks again for being with us today.
Well, Ski, great for that wonderful, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I appreciate it a lot. It's always a lot of fun to come down to your neck of the woods to see what's happening. You people do a marvelous job with the Civil War Roundtable, and I simply do want to just mention two people who one of whom is no longer with us, the other one maybe, but Tuffy and Sissy McFarland. They were our guests, Jean and my hosts, I should say, and they were just wonderful people. And so what I'd like to do is just offer this talk that I'm going to be giving in a few moments in their memory, because they were just terrific people. But what I'd like to talk to you today, and I should mention too, that we have the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library at Mississippi State. So I'd invite all of you to come and see what we have. It's absolutely marvelous. We have printed a number of the letters, etc. It's really amazing, and we have some wonderful things to see too. And this pictures that you see on the screen, of course, you see Sherman is on the right, and on the left is a picture of U.S. Grant as president. I was going to use one where he was dressed in uniform, but I thought, no, I think I'll just do it this way. Because the whole thing began, after all, in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was elected president of the United States. And it was around that time, too, as you well know, that South Carolina seceded. Then in 1861, a number of other states, slave states, followed suit, and they formed the Confederate States of America. and Jefferson Davis became the president of the Confederate States. In March of 1861, as we well know, Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as the 14th president of the United States. And in April, Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, the federal installation in Charleston Harbor. And as one person so eloquently put it, and the war came. But keep in mind, too, that it came precipitously and it came quickly. What happened was the nation was split in two by this Civil War of the 1860s. Nobody expected anything like a civil war to take place, but it did. So I'm going to ask Natalie if you would show the slide of James Chestnut Jr. Thank you. The reason I even use this picture is because we always hear about James Chestnut Jr. He was a Confederate colonel, and more importantly, he was the husband of the famous Mary Chestnut, the author of A Diary from Dixie. And he made one of the most famous statements about the war, indicating what was going to happen. He said, he predicted that the amount of blood spilled in the Civil War would not even fill a lady's thimble. That tells you something, I think. Southerners were also convinced that Northerners were just a bunch of shopkeepers after all, and they did not have it in them to do any fighting. Many Southerners believed, and it's another famous statement that was made by a Southerner, quote, "You can slap a Yankee in the face and he will sue, but he won't fight." So we can show those pictures of Grant and Sherman again, Natalie. We know, of course, the war did come. The Civil War came, and young men from both the North and the South left their civilian jobs and joined the respective armies, the Confederate Army or the Union Army. Among these people were a host of West Pointers who had studied warfare and engineering, after all, at the United States Military Academy. Many of those who stayed in the Army went after graduation. They stayed on to gain enough time in office, so to speak, so that they'd be fulfilling their military obligations, what I'm trying to say. They became career officers, and they might be stationed at isolated posts all throughout the nation. Or perhaps they fought in the Mexican-American War, or they fought in the Seminole Wars in Florida. Or some of these people who joined the two armies had quit the Army and taken on civilian jobs, but they left the civilian jobs, they had some military training, so they became involved in this Civil War. Now, among the young and the not so young men who had entered the two competing armies in 1861 were two individuals who would become household names during the next 4 years, and as we well know, have been remembered ever since. Hardly anyone had heard of either of these men before the 1860s. In fact, I think it'd be fair to say that both men were considered losers after they graduated from West Point. Sherman graduated in 1840. Grant graduated in 1843. And so from 1840 to 1843 to the beginning of the Civil War, they did a lot of things that I've already mentioned. But the point was that they were not well known. Nobody knew who U.S. Grant or William Tecumseh Sherman was. Both had not become career soldiers, although they stayed in the Army for a time. And Grant did fight in the Mexican-American War, while Sherman found himself in California, the backwater of that war. Sherman resigned his commission in 1853 and became a banker in California, and then later moved to New York. He was not very successful. Not his fault, but he was not successful. While Grant, meanwhile, resigned his commission in 1854 and had gone into farming. And as it turned out, he wasn't much of a farmer either. He tried a number of things and it didn't work. Both were extremely, so what I'm saying is they were both extremely unsuccessful in the civilian tasks they undertook. It's interesting to note that when the war came, U.S. Grant wanted to join the Union Army, but the Army would not have him. Finally, the governor of a place you may know, Illinois, a man by the name of Richard Yates, who was the who's the governor of Illinois, gave Grant the command of the obstreperous 21st Illinois Volunteer Regiment. And what it came out to be, of course, was nobody wanted to command that unit anyway. And besides the fact, nobody could even handle these people. They were so awful. The commanding officer they had was that awful too. Sherman, just the opposite, didn't want to join the Union Army because he was sure that just like the recent past, he would again be pulled down to some sort of failure. He believed that the United States was simply not taking the Confederacy seriously enough. So he simply refused to join up. And he said, no, I will not join. Even when his family asked him to join the Army, he did not want to. And yet, it is true, when the war ended just 4 years later, 1861 to 1865, Ulysses S. Grant, William T. Sherman, and by the way, fell in by another Illinois man named Abraham Lincoln. These three people were three of the architects of the victory that had preserved the Union and had freed the slaves. Grant and Sherman, particularly, we're going to talk about them, had risen from the bottom rungs of American society to become among its leaders. Yet, if people had been asked to evaluate these two men in 1861, that evaluation would hardly have included the legacy that the two men left the nation in 1865. Nobody knew or wanted to know Ulysses S. Grant or William Tecumseh Sherman. Grant and Grant and Sherman got to know each other when Sherman provided Grant with some supplies during the early part of the war in the West. Even though Sherman had 3 years seniority on Grant, as you know, from when they graduated from West Point, he accepted orders from his junior. So Sherman took orders from Grant. And he also, when he sent supplies to help him in these battles that he was carrying on, he accepted orders from Grant, and at the same time, he sent him encouraging notes of support. Every time he'd send some supplies, he would send some encouraging note of some kind of support. But it's fair to say that they hardly knew one another. And we can look at the next slide, please. Yeah, this is one that I'm not going to ask you to read in detail and memorize the amount of people who were in the battles, etc. But it was during this battle, during the Battle of Shiloh, that the two men were able to see each other in action for the first time. At Shiloh, Grant saw Sherman putting his life on the line several times, heroically, to stem the unexpected, totally unexpected Confederate all-day offensive. Sherman saw Grant's steadiness during that same awful night when, with the rain pouring down, Sherman saw just how special Grant was. At that time, too, Sherman was a division commander at Shiloh, whereas Grant still had overall command over Sherman. He commanded the entire Union force, the Army of the Tennessee, in the battle. Sherman saw how defeated and demoralized Union troops were, with Confederates at the end of the first day even occupying Union tents. So he prepared himself to give Grant the information that he had, and he expected Grant to give him instructions for a retreat. If you would just look at show the next slide, please. Now, this would be the rainy night slide.
John, I think I missed that one.
Okay,
sorry.
No problem. Well, that is not one of my better slides anyway. But what it shows the battlefield the next night, the night of the first day, and it actually shows what this is showing you in figures, but it doesn't matter. But anyway, Sherman went up to Grant, and something told him not to say too much about retreat in front of this determined general. Instead, Sherman blurted out to Grant, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" It's pouring down rain. Grant hardly stirs as the rain keeps coming down. He responds calmly, "Lick 'em tomorrow, though." Sherman can't believe it. They had been killed in that first day of battle, and that was it. What Grant basically said to Sherman and his other officers was, "We're going to attack the next day, the next morning, along the entire front." So the next day, Union troops charged with a whoop and swept the Confederates off the battlefield back toward the city of Corinth. From this point on, remembrances of Sherman's heroics that first day and Grant's refusal to retreat during the rainstorm that night caused the two men to become fast friends. So what I'm arguing is that these two men, thank you for those pictures, these two men came to know each other, see what each was capable of at Shiloh, and from that point on, they will remain friends for the rest of their lives. There was some problem at the end of the life. We'll talk of that later. But the important thing I think to note is that the enormous friendship that developed between the two men developed into an unbreakable trust, and it became absolutely crucial, the relationship between these two men to the outcome of the war. Grant and Sherman came to trust each other so completely that there was never during that Civil War ever a disagreement important enough to get in the way of their military cooperation. Now, this unbending trust was important, for this reason. The two men were able to completely cooperate with one another, even when they disagreed. So, for example, after Union soldiers had pushed the Confederates back from Shiloh to Corinth, General Henry W. Halleck, Old Brains as he was known at that time, came close to dismissing Grant from the Union Army because he considered Grant to be a sloppy general. He didn't even know how to fill out the reports the proper way. And even before the Union troops had taken control of Corinth, Halleck took major command away from Grant. Remember, he's the great commander at Shiloh. This is not the case when they're attacking onto Corinth. So it got so bad that what Halleck did to Grant was to bypass him to the point that Grant even considered quitting the war. What kept him staying in the Union Army was Sherman. Sherman heard the rumors about Grant leaving, ran over to Grant's camp, and basically argued with Grant that he should stay longer. He should not quit. So that decision was made by Grant to stay in the Army because his friend, his man he trusted completely, William T. Sherman, said he should stay in the Army, and he did. And the result is that Grant is able to stay in the Army. And as you know, later on, he becomes the great general. We can just go to the next slide. Yeah, next one, please. Yeah, this one is, you've seen this a lot, but this is the best vision of this that I've ever seen. This is a picture of Chickasaw Bayou, just outside in Mississippi, just off where Sherman charged up that his men charged up the hill. He got creamed, just got creamed. He suffered a crushing defeat to Sherman at Chickasaw Bayou in December of 1862. And one of the reasons why it was so bad was that Grant simply did not do all he could have to support Sherman as the two men had planned it to happen. And the result was, of course, that trying to charge up that hill that you see in front of you in that picture doesn't work. Here is an excellent possibility for the two men to blame each other. To have Sherman say, Grant, if you'd only helped me out, I'd have done okay. If Grant had said, Sherman, if you'd only fought better, we could have taken that hill. So that is one of the things that could have happened. Why didn't it happen? Because they trusted each other. They believed and they saw that each side tried to do what it could to help the other. Sherman did not blame Grant, and Grant did not blame Sherman. What happened was that both men and their armies simply kept pressing forward. They kept moving forward. They were not stopped by what would have hurt the relationship between any two other generals. We can show those pictures of Grant, and there we are. Perhaps most significant of all, of course, is the fact that Sherman captured Atlanta in September of 1864, and at that time he drove off John Bell Hood's Confederate Army. Now that's important, not so much, of course it's important that Atlanta fell, but after that battle, Sherman said to Grant and also said to Lincoln, what I'd like to do is now do a new kind of warfare. I'd like permission from you and Lincoln to conduct what came to be called the March to the Sea. Lincoln and Grant were both opposed to that idea because they both believed that in destroying Hood's army and psychologically waging a war of destruction would be much more important than simply doing what they had been doing up to this point. Sherman kept insisting on the importance of destruction, and he convinced Grant to agree. And once that happened, Lincoln came on board, that the warfare should not be warfare where one side wins a battle and captures an army, but just the opposite, where an army is destroyed, where areas are taken, and where both sides keep pushing forward. Grant, and why did this happen? Because Grant believed in Sherman. He was confident. In fact, he said to Lincoln and to some other people that he couldn't think of any other person that he would think of, that he would use, that he would give permission for anybody else to wage the new kind of war, the war of destruction. Well, in the end, then, this relationship developed even more. Grant proved accurate in his assessment of Sherman, both men came to realize that they could trust each other completely, and that's the key factor. And so they were able to undertake military action that would have been impossible without such a relationship. That point that Grant makes, and Lincoln actually makes it too, there's no other person they would allow to march to the sea as they did Sherman, because they believed Sherman was the only person that was capable of doing it, which means what? It means that there's absolute trust between Grant and Sherman. The final result was, of course, victory. The march to the sea is a tremendous victory for the Union troops. And why did it happen? Why was it possible that it happened? It happened because of the relationship of Grant and Sherman. So when the war ends, the important thing that happens is these two men whom nobody knew at all. I mean, who's Grant? Who's Sherman? We have no idea. But when the war ends, they have made a name for themselves. And both men came to develop a relationship that is unlike any other relationship that went on during the war. If you take, for example, the Confederate Army, Confederate generals were constantly arguing with one another about, well, do this, do that. You should have done that. You should have done that. This is not happening with Sherman and Grant. But what they did learn during the war was the absolute importance of mutual trust and support that the two men had for one another. They were totally different people. You look at those pictures and you see they don't look anything similar. They look completely different. They have totally different personalities. If Grant should come into a meeting of the round table in your area, he would find a place in the back of the room and just kind of try to not to talk, then even not to do anything. Sherman and the other would walk and say, "Hey, Charlie," and he'd pat you on the back, hit you forward. "Yeah, boy, we did a great job there." So they're totally different personalities. But the important thing is that they brought out the best in each other. Now, the truth of the matter is both men could have concentrated on the weaknesses they each had, and they did have weaknesses. But what actually happened is Grant and Sherman see only each other's strength, the strengths that the two men have. Sherman sees Grant's strengths, Grant sees Sherman's strengths, and they ignore the weaknesses. And they concentrate on that. They concentrate on the ability that the two men have to get things done. They trusted each other. And that's another very, very important point. If Grant said to Sherman or Sherman said to Grant, "We're going to do X, Y, and Z," that's it. It was agreed upon. It was done. That's the end of it. And so they ended up fighting this Civil War together, not separately. They showed, I think, as no others could or did show during this war, just how important complete trust between two leading figures on the one side for military success. Secondly, both Grant and Sherman were strong believers in themselves. This is something we don't often think about. They were completely free in their praise of one another. For example, when at the major battle of Vicksburg, some politicians came after the battle, et cetera, et cetera. Before the battle was fought, Sherman said, "Don't do it, Grant. It's a big mistake you're doing. It's a terrible, terrible thing." But what happens when these politicians come? Sherman tells everybody who would listen that they were wrong in criticizing, and he had been wrong in criticizing his plans, his overall plans at Vicksburg. When Grant was promoted, after Vicksburg because of that success and of course other successes too. What did Grant do? Grant immediately shifted praise to Sherman and to General McPherson also. The two men saw clearly, and this is a major point, they didn't have to build up each other. We've heard from Frank and we heard from Craig talking about how some of the generals spend all their time building themselves up. In this particular case, both Grant and Sherman did not have to selfishly build themselves up, but they could freely give credit to the other one. Such freely given generosity cemented this relationship that they had. And most importantly, when they were planning a battle, and Grant said, Sherman, I want you to do such, 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 such. Sherman may not like it, but he'd do it anyway. And so what develops is this relationship of coming together and obeying each other and taking what the other one says and not trying to build up somebody. And what this did, one of the others, to build up one or other of the people. So what this did, this ensured victory in the future because both Grant and Sherman could believe completely that they didn't have to watch their backs. Their backs were taken care of. The other gentleman, the other general would take care of things. Third point, both Grant and Sherman left a legacy of determination. Now, it's true, of course, both men wanted to achieve personal success. And they learned throughout their lives that this could only be accomplished through a purposeful, determined effort. Remember, I said previously that neither men had been very successful during the early years of the war, before the war began. In fact, they failed so many different ways, and we could spend half this talk talking about the ways that they failed, that it would have been easy. It'd been easy for them to quit early on because they were screwing things up. There's no question about this. Read some of the stuff that's said about Grant at Shiloh, and this is where Sherman sees the importance of this man. So what basically did happen? The determination stayed there. The two men failed in so many different ways that it would have been easy for them to have quit early on. Instead, they pushed through their disappointments, showed determination to make something significant of their generalship in the Civil War. And the important thing to note is that their determination didn't get weaker, it got stronger the longer the war went on. Another thing that both men had to have, and something that they learned, is that determination was not the only thing necessary for success. An individual also had to have what we might refer to as native intelligence to deal with the problems that might come his way. Both Grant and Sherman realized early in the war that they had to study every aspect of anything that they approached. And then, once they looked at all this, then they could decide the best way to deal with it. They didn't just jump into battles. Now, did they make mistakes? Yes, they did. Did they both make mistakes? Yes, they did. But they had enough common sense to be able to realize that willingness to change was essential to any problem. If they saw something they had to do militarily and they didn't react to it as they should have, or as they would have, as they could have, I should say, I suppose, you wouldn't get it any place. So, for example, take a look at Grant's reaction to the Vicksburg conundrum. that's a good example of some of this things that I'm talking about. He tried one approach after another to take Vicksburg. And I'm not going to repeat all of them, but one after another, each one failed. They went up this area. They went up through this thing. The Confederates dropped trees down in their path, and the water, and etc. Sherman was smart enough to keep cooperating with Grant at Vicksburg, even though he would not have tried to do it in the same way. In fact, there's a very famous scene where Sherman comes riding up, and Grant is basically cut off, and excuse me, and Sherman says, yeah, Grant, it's a good thing you needed some help. And this was Admiral Porter who was involved in this too. So they both realized that they needed each other. They couldn't do it by themselves. They couldn't take on this responsibility themselves, this attitude themselves. They still had to work together. Even though they might disagree about the best way to do something, they still did it. Another thing that Grant and Sherman demonstrated in this war was what we might call moral and physical courage, which they demonstrated throughout the Civil War. At Shiloh, and we haven't talked about this, but Sherman repeatedly exposed himself to wounding and death, being hit several times by minie balls, to the point he could have gotten killed. In fact, one of his aides was killed on a horse right next to him. But what Sherman did, Sherman kept moving forward. At Chattanooga, there's some famous scenes where Sherman says, we got to go this way and we got to go this way. And let me just follow me. You fellows know, we'll just do what I do and we'll be fine. Well, the problem was that Sherman was exposing himself so much that some of his men had to yell at him to get down or face serious injury. Grant knew that. Grant knew that Sherman was doing that. He didn't think it was a good idea, but he said, doggone it, the guy's got guts. And importantly, too, Grant recognizes that Sherman is courageous enough to try something new in warfare, the so-called march to the sea. Somebody earlier asked a question about why was it that Lincoln had so much trouble finding somebody to fight the war the way he wanted it to. Fact of the matter was that Grant and Sherman and Lincoln both came to realize the destructive war is the way to win this war, not the way the war is being settled. And so that was done. Now Grant doesn't encounter danger on the battlefield as regularly as Sherman does, but his courage, his willingness to take a risk is always evident anyway. For example, and I've given you this example already, at Shiloh, his army is soundly defeated at Shiloh that first day. And yet, Grant had the audacity, had the courage to say, doesn't matter, we're going to go on the attack, we're not going to retreat that next morning, and we're going to pull victories out of the jaws of apparent and almost certain defeat. It was almost impossible to think that Grant could have pulled off what happened at Shiloh. The most important legacy, I think, that Grant and Sherman leave the American military and the American nation is their strategic version of war. Grant realized early on something that Lincoln was hammering at constantly. Grant realized that the Civil War was not simply Virginia. Robert E. Lee is constantly trying to capture Virginia. Some of these other generals, Union generals, are trying to capture Virginia. But this is not what it was. The Civil War was not simply Virginia. It was nationwide. It was a battle to win all over the place, not just in Virginia. Grant and Sherman both realized that the ideas of Antoine Henri Jomini, the principles that he came up with, were not the way to win the war. That's old-fashioned. We've got to try something different. He saw that war was not simply a matter of moving around, maneuvering, I guess would be the best word, maneuvering masses of one's own troops against fractions of the enemy. That's what Antoine Henri Jomini, the leading military thinker, the Frenchman who fights with the Russians, this is what he comes up with. Grant and Sherman and Lincoln realize this is not the way to do it. The important thing is not to capture important geographic positions. The thing to do is to defeat the other army, not to capture important geographic locations. Grant came to understand that. Lincoln came to understand that, and so did Sherman. That to win this war, you had to fight it everywhere, putting pressure on the enemy, not just in one particular area or one certain place, but everywhere simultaneously. All three men realized that the Union Army had more ability to do this than did the Confederates. So why aren't we doing it? And so it was done. Sherman realized that the destruction of the enemy's army was more important than the capture of any strategic place. Sherman was even blunter. He said to win the war, to avoid the horrendous fatalities and casualties in combat and disease, he had to destroy Confederacy's property instead. Confederates had to be shown in their heads that they had no hope of survival, let alone they had no hope of any victory, unless the only way the Confederates could ever survive this war was if they quit fighting it the Jominian way, the old way, by capturing areas, and fight the new way, the way of destruction. And if you go through that, you see Lincoln has been trying to tell his generals that for a long time. And finally, Grant and Sherman say that and agree with him and do it. So the military insights that Grant and Sherman put into practice were, in short, physical and psychological destruction of the Confederate Army and society, trust and support of one another, praise for each other, Grant praising Sherman, Sherman praising Grant, determination never to quit, that if you lose a battle, you push on forward and you win it the next day. Common sense, courage is very, very important. And Sherman and Grant come to see this, and they both come to the same agreement. And that is a crucial factor in why the Civil War ends up the way it does. Grant and Sherman saw these approaches and saw that all of them are indivisible. They must, not just one or two can be done, but all of it must be done at the same time. That when they combined, when the two of them combined and took the power that each had individually and combined it to work together, the result was Union victory. So the legacy of Grant and Sherman, like the friendship of the two men, is very complicated. But it demonstrated to the world, to the United States, I should say, first of all, and then to the world, important lessons for keeping the nation together as one. Grant and Sherman were individually impressive individuals, and individually, the way they fought the war, they kept the nation as one. But here's the main point, it seems to me. Together, they prove unstoppable. And together, they leave a legacy that would influence American warfare from that point into American history. Thank you for listening to all of this, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. Don't ask any tough ones because I might not be able to answer them.
Yes, John, first question. Can you contrast, or I know you can, but will you contrast and compare the surrenders that both generals superintended?
Surrenders that they, how do you,
Well,
what
like
do you?
Grant was in Appomattox with Lee. Sherman was in North Carolina with Joseph Johnston.
I see.
Can you
Okay.
compare those two and contrast those two types of surrenders, or two terms of the surrenders? And
I see what, I was thinking of something totally different. No, I think you're right. I think that what happened was Grant realized, let's look at Grant and Lee first. Grant realized that he had to take some sort of a stand and win this war. But this did not necessarily mean that he had to give in anything. And so what he did when he was battling with Lee is he was continuing to fight, the last year or so where they kept pressing. And by the way, Sherman was doing the same thing in the other area of the country. So I think in both instances, they came to show both Confederate generals, Johnston and Lee, that you just can't capture an area. You've got to defeat the army, and this is what Grant and Sherman do to the Confederate army. They defeat it completely. They squash it, I think would be the best way to do it. So I think they come to realize when they put into practice those ideas that they normally nobody else is doing at the early time of war. And that's why Sherman and Grant are so important, because they recognize the biggest importance. And I think too, the other thing would be that in both cases, they were very kind in their surrender. Grant let Lee off very easily, and Sherman left Johnston off quite easily. And so I think that has something to do with it. In fact, I still get questions from people saying, well, how come they did that? Why didn't they just, because that's the way they were. They just wanted to win this war, bring the nation together again, and not worry about how you're going to, win some other aspect of the conflict.
thank you.
All right, John, we've got a few questions for you.
Okay.
Let me go up. We've got one from Dan, who asks, would history judge the march to the sea differently had Hood prevailed at Spring Hill, Tennessee? Would the outcome have been the same either way?
I think the latter. I think I find it difficult to think that if it had been different at Spring Hill, somehow the war would have gone. I think by that time, the war is so far advanced, the Union is so far advanced in its ability to win this war, that there's very little that the Confederacy can do. And what has happened is that the war of destruction is finally taking its toll. I think that's really the whole issue.
The next question asks, what was Sheridan's relationship with these two men?
Yes. Sherman thought a great deal of Sheridan, and so did Grant. And I think the main reason that they both felt that way, and keep in mind too, that Sheridan is not the surrender person at Appomattox or with Joe Johnston. He believes that it is necessary to destroy the other side in order to win it. And his destruction includes just destroying everything that gets in his way. So you have, for example, it's Sheridan who says in the West, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. You know, many people think that that's something Sherman says, but it's not. It's something Sheridan says. And that's why, and Sheridan is mean and tough. It's the same thing in Louisiana. So I would think, yeah, that they both like the guy because he gets results. They tell him, do this, do that, and he does it.
The next question is from Robert, who asks, given that both Grant and Lee were West Point graduates, fought during the Mexican-American War, and ultimately were opposing commanding generals, what was the relationship like between those two?
Oh, okay. Interestingly enough, you know that Lee is an older man. He's got heart problems, etc. What one of the things that they decide, I think, on is that they should they like each other in that Grant says, for example, you remember me? We talked during the Mexican War. Well, I don't really remember that, but they actually felt that as long as the Union would win, as long as the Confederacy would lose, it didn't much matter about somebody getting something or getting having a situation where the one is able to have some things done where other one is not. I think they both agree. They're both West Pointers. They're both willing to fight this war to the end, and both of them are. I mean, we talk about Grant and his activity in Virginia, but Sherman was, Lee was actually fighting in that Virginia too, and he was fighting hard. He was losing a lot of men. In fact, studies that have been done show that actually the number of people who died under Grant was fewer than those who fought under Lee. Lee did not have any idea of saying, oh no, we're not going to follow this. He tried to do it, but by the time he got that message, the Union victory had been assured by all these other things that had been accomplished up to that point.
And we have a question from John, who says, describe the importance of the telegraph in coordinating strategy between Grant and Sherman during the Civil War.
Now, that is very, very important. It's very important, not just between those two men, but between all the various soldiers and all the other various generals, actually on both sides. You know, we even have examples of using balloons early in the war. So that is certainly part of it. And certainly the telegraph makes it easier to spread out the army, to tell the other side, to tell your other commanders what they should be doing or what they should not be doing. And it provides a whole new way of looking at things. And I think both people gained that. But I think it's fair to say that the Union Army does a much better job of using that information to take care of victory in various places.
Those are all the questions in the chat right now. I don't know if Ski, you have anything else you want, or John, you have anything you want to wrap up with before we go to a break?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that maybe show a picture of me. So, because I've met so many people there, and give them a chance to. There's Ski in there.
Well, why aren't you? Do you have your video on?
I don't.
I say if you're we see you.
Oh, we see. Okay, that's good. That's about all I wanted to say, and I just want to thank Ski and thank all the people in Ohio who have done such wonderful. This is one of the really great symposia that takes place every year. And so thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's the quality of speaker that we have, like you and Craig and Frank, and then Pete upcoming, that make our symposium what it does. And I appreciate you mentioning Tuffy. He's a dear friend. He is my right-hand man. But you know, people stand up and fill the gap, and that's what's happened. And but Tuffy is beloved and he is missed. And thank you for mentioning that. Appreciate it.
He is one of the, as you know, he's one of my favorite people. He and his wife were so nice to us and took us around. Even, I think I told you, they even took us to church one Sunday morning,
Yeah.
even though they missed the beginning of the service by 1 hour. We sat for an hour, but that didn't matter. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John.